I would guess in most places you can look around and find an opportunity to invest. I mean, you need to keep in mind what your long-term goals are, and what you're trying to accomplish. But yeah, I think a little bit of fortune, just being close to an area that I believe strongly in. And, to your point about like the bigger pockets rush to some of these towns, I have seen like the Manchester, Nashua metro area on some of these lists for rent growth, and like national lists.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be whatever, Austin, Miami, Manchester, Nashua, and you're like, what is that? But I can say last 4 or 5 years, we've seen 10+% rent growth for, long-term rentals. You could probably push more, but there's a practicality to it too. And you want to keep your tenants happy and keep your tenants
Yeah.
in the building and paying. So yeah, it's interesting.
Welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Law Podcast. Jason Muth here with Pride Away Stays and straightforward short-term rentals. Rory, our resident attorney, real estate attorney and broker. What's up, Rory?
Not much. I'm thrilled I feel like today we're getting back to the nuts and bolts of real estate investing, why we get into it in the first place. And that is, making smart investments in local markets that you understand and trust, and thinking about taking the long-term approach. What's going to win out, what's going to earn you the best, maybe the slow and steady method. So going back to the nuts and bolts today, and I'm really looking forward to it.
We're going to talk about some underwriting, talking about building a portfolio from the ground up while you're working your full-time job. We are going way back to the beginning of us, of how, not the beginning of us, Rory, you and I, but let's welcome our guest because he's right here. This is Kyle Joseph. Kyle is a real estate investor out of New England. He's living in New Hampshire right now. What's going on, Kyle?
Yeah, it's great to talk to you guys again. It's been a while.
It has been a long time. I say this, because one of the very, 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 very first real estate meetups that Rory and I went to, Kyle was there. I believe it was in the Seaport in Boston, and we
Yes.
didn't know what we were doing. I don't know why you showed up. I don't know why we showed up, but we all showed up, and we're like, oh, you're interested in real estate. We're interested in real estate. And then, fast forward many years later, and we're doing our short-term rental thing. Rory's doing his law thing and broker thing. You are working full-time in a capacity that involves some of the skills for understanding deals and real estate. And you actually have some investments on the side as well, which is a smart life decision for yourself to be able to have another stream of income. So you're actually doing what none of us knew we were going to be doing when we first met, right?
Yeah, I know. It's cool to kind of go full circle here and talk to you guys again, because I think at the time, I don't think you guys had bought any properties yet. I don't think I had bought any properties yet. And you guys have, grown in a lot of ways, and I have too. So happy to jump into it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure if we had our first short-term rental or not, but you bring something up, and that at some point along the journey, you decide that not only are you doing it, but that you're in it and you could say that you're doing it. And I've been to real estate meetups. I just spoke at one recently, and I meet people that were in our shoes, Kyle, like back when we first met. This is probably 2015 or so. This is almost a decade ago at this point. And they're looking at us, these people that are now talking about what we're doing, saying, how do I start? How do I do that? I mean, you were right there, probably at that same exact meetup that we were.
Yeah, I was. I know I was living in the Seaport at the time with my then girlfriend, now wife. And yeah, I met you guys, and it's funny because it just kind of shows, I guess, the importance of some of these networking events. I mean, you and I have stayed in touch, a little bit, but our paths really haven't crossed a lot. But just by meeting in person, kind of being in the same position at the same time, and then going our separate ways and growing in different ways, it's just been enough to keep a connection. And here we are talking, whatever it is, 6-7 years later.
Rory, Kyle's got a lot less gray hair than I do at this point. I think I was, back then, I was a little bit younger. We all were. But all right, so Kyle, tell us about yourself. And that's a really good starting point.
Yeah, sure. As you mentioned, I live here in New Hampshire and invest here in New Hampshire. So my background is sort of twofold. So I've been out of college for about 12 years now, largely in real estate. I started my career in a large financial services company. Did that for a couple years. It was great, but realized, I was sort of doing like finance back of office support. And I was like, how do I get to the front of it, and sort of be on the transaction side? Didn't have any real estate experience at the time. Had an opportunity to sort of transfer within that larger company into their private equity real estate division, and sort of instantly was enamored with real estate. I've always been sort of like a numbers guy, deal junkie, but I also really appreciate sort of the physical aspect of real estate. So once I got there, I was like, okay, I think this is something I want to do for a while. Was able to sort of over a year or two move my way to go from more of again, like a back of house role to sort of like a front of house, meaning focusing on deal sourcing, underwriting, acquisition, development type stuff, and capital raising extent. So that was my first 2 or 3 years. And from there, I just kind of went with it. So since then, I've worked at a number of very large private equity real estate groups, development companies. I've worked at some regional and local operators. I've worked at some effectively startup development companies. And today I work at a regional operator doing similar things, working on underwriting, acquisitions, deal sourcing, capital raising, all of that sort of stuff. And so we had alluded to, you and I met 6-7 years ago. About that time, I kind of also started trying to figure out how I can, invest myself. I had a moment when I was at the very first company when we acquired a building. It was a large office building, and I saw a wire for $323 million be wired, all cash, close, right? And I said, genuinely, like, I don't have like aspirations for, something of that magnitude personally, but I was like, that is ultimate control, and sort of like, control of your destiny. If you can have the money to be going and buying cash and doing those sorts of things. So I said, I need to be doing this for myself, and trying to figure out how I can kind of build my own portfolio and get to a point where I sort of control my own destiny in that way. So about 5-6 years ago, when you and I met, I was starting to do the whole, going on bigger pockets and networking events and just trying to figure out, I understood sort of very complex transactions on a spreadsheet and all that, kind of understood how to work with institutional tenants and all that stuff. But it's weirdly very different experience to work on a 3-unit multifamily, a Class B, in a tertiary, town in New Hampshire. It's very different. And when you're putting your own money at risk, it feels very different. So I've sort of gone through that journey and, accumulated a small portfolio with my wife here in New Hampshire. We continue to try to grow that as well.
Wow. All right. So much to unpack right there. Thank you for that background. Rory, what's your initial takeaway from what you heard with Kyle's story?
I mean, for people who are listening, who are just jumping in the space, I think you just had kind of a roadmap of how things could play out for you if you stay persistent in the space and keep making progress toward your goals and your interest in real estate. But I also see like the great motivation there. And we're talking about big markets, we're talking about the city, we're talking about major projects. But most of us don't get started there. We do work locally. There's it's saying this that you hear on bigger pockets all the time, saying that within a 2-hour drive from wherever you are, there's a market that you can invest in, and that's typically true too for us. So we started up in New Hampshire as well, a different pocket of New Hampshire. But yeah, what made you decide to start just shopping New Hampshire specifically, and what made you stay in New England when we have investment opportunities all around the country?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because for work, I was doing work sort of all around the country. So I did see sort of at in different product types. I wasn't doing multifamily at the time, but I was seeing other markets. I guess what I've realized is, number one, getting started, I do find it's easier to be local if you can. That doesn't mean you need to be in your backyard, but being able to be within, like you said, a couple-hour drive is important. And then for me, when it comes to real estate investing, everything that we do is typically long-term. That doesn't mean we haven't, like I mentioned to you guys before we started, but we are on a contract to sell a property. But my intent is always long-term. So I'm sort of looking at big macro trends or demographics and sort of big shifts and making like long-term bets on real estate, right? So I know we're going to talk about underwriting at some point, and that gets very nitty-gritty. But at the end of the day, the real tail when you're trying to ride is where are people going, where is employment and all of that. And so when you look at an area like New England where I wanted to invest, New Hampshire to me is sort of the, what's happened in like the Southeast or Texas equivalent to New England, where you have I think it's the only state, or maybe one of two states, that has actual population growth in New England. It has job growth, and you have high quality of life. You have a low cost of living. So these are all things that like you think of when people talk about Nashville or Florida or Austin, right? Different scale, totally, but these are really important things. And what happens is people, people that live in New England like to stay in New England typically. You retire, maybe you go down to Florida, but your family's here, your family's been here for generations. And, it's not as easy as I think people make it sound, especially once you have families and kids in schools and all that, to pick up and move across the country. So they say, what's an alternative? So New Hampshire's benefited from that. And particularly its proximity to Boston and Massachusetts. They've taken different regulatory approaches and approaches to business. And it's a great state to landlord in. And so I sort of added all those up, and I said, and it's like, oh, by the way, I know New Hampshire. I grew up in New Hampshire. And so I just was like, I'm going to start making long-term bets on New Hampshire.
Mm-hmm. Part of me wants to not talk about New Hampshire because I don't want the secret to get out, right?
I know, I know.
But no, but I want to talk about it though, because we don't talk about our markets too much. I mean, we go into like what we do, but New Hampshire has made us, made me not have to go back to work for a W-2 job. That's what our properties in New Hampshire have done. So we feel really grateful for the properties that we purchased and the work that we're doing in New Hampshire. We are big advocates for investing in New Hampshire. Again, I hesitate to say this, but not like we have the biggest audience like Bigger Pockets does. But what happened in all of the markets that Bigger Pockets and all the big real estate podcasts talked about? They got slammed and oversaturated. And they just had a huge uptick in, a gold rush to purchasing property. And a lot of those markets are now, they've peaked and they're on the downswing now. I mean, there's so much inventory on the market in a lot of these places. We're not seeing that in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
I mean, Rory just left what's the magazine that you left for me with a sticky saying you might be interested in this, like the 603 Realtor or whatever it was?
The New Hampshire Realtor magazine. Yeah. Just to take a look at the stats.
And I'd seen the stats already because I saw them online, but inventory is down, prices are up, growth is up in every single county, all the way from, Stratford and Rockingham all the way up to Coos County. Like, people want to live there. They want to buy that second home there. They want to invest there for all the reasons, Kyle, that you cited. Population growth, economy, stability with jobs. Those are the metrics you should be looking at if you're an investor and you're looking for a market. I love what you said in that you knew the market. I mean, you're from New Hampshire, right? Originally?
I am. Yeah. Yeah. I grew up there.
You lived there, you left, for college and for, for your first couple of years living in the city, and then you gradually worked your way back to New Hampshire. There's a comfort level with investing in what we know. And if what we know happens to work out financially, then why not do it? Like, personally, I don't feel like I need to be looking at all these Rust Belt towns or areas across the country that I'm super not familiar with, because I have a comfort level in what I can see and what I could drive to. We're going to be at our properties next week.
I agree with you. I think you can, I would guess in most places you can look around and find an opportunity to invest. I mean, you need to keep in mind what your long-term goals are, and what you're trying to accomplish. But yeah, I think a little bit of fortune, just being close to an area that I believe strongly in. And, to your point about like the Bigger Pockets rush to some of these towns, I have seen the Manchester, Nashua metro area on some of these lists for rent growth, and like national lists. So it'll be whatever, Austin, Miami, Manchester, Nashua. And you're like, what is that? But I can say last 4 or 5 years we've seen 10+% rent growth for long-term rentals. You could probably push more, but there's a practicality to it too, and you want to keep your tenants happy and keep your tenants in the building and paying. So yeah, it's interesting.
We too have seen those same lists. So maybe we should stop talking about New Hampshire right now.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So
maybe we move on.
everybody turn away, look somewhere else, go to a different market, let us in New England, just continue doing what we're doing. Okay. So, but that dovetails into underwriting. Okay. So you have a background in this, like from the work that you do for your full-time job. And we've talked about, lots of people talk about leaving their full-time job to do this full-time. A lot of people talk about transitioning from one to the other. I am a big proponent of working W-2 jobs to get lots of experience, both like from a practical sense and networking and meeting people and getting good habits, good job habits, showing up somewhere, having deadlines, but I'm also a proponent of when it's time to move on, figuring out that transition point that you could then move on for your next chapter. One great skill you're gaining, but I've been out of college longer than you have, so I could say you're gaining it because you're still working, is you're learning a lot of this stuff with what you do all day, every day, and you're seeing $300 million wires, which I don't
Right.
aspire to that either. But hey, last week we got a wire for 120 grand and I loved it, right? We sold a property
Sure.
and I'll take that money, right? You're going to get a wire soon if you sell your property. Tell us about the things you're learning on the job right now about underwriting that you've applied into some of your investments on the side.
Sure. And I will say if a $323 million wire shows up, I won't be disappointed. It's just it's not in my, short-term plans. So I would say for underwriting, what you learn is that it's really all about the inputs. So what I've learned is, through working in sort of larger, more complex deals, not just multifamily, but industrial, office, life science, retail. So it's like all sorts of different food groups. And then you layer in different types of debt, you layer in different types of equity investors. Like the model itself can get quite complicated, right? And I think sometimes people think they need those really highly sophisticated models. The reality is, what I've learned over time doing this for a while is it's really just it's all about the inputs, right? And that's why for me, it took me a while to make sort of the leap, if you want to call it, from underwriting, large institutional real estate deals to a 3-unit deal in the state that we're no longer naming, because the inputs are different and the inputs matter. How do you determine what your repairs and maintenance is going to be on the property when you've never owned one? You might talk to some people and get some feedback, but the most complicated model, if you put the wrong number in there, you're going to end up with sort of a bad outcome. So I would say that's my primary takeaway is, and it sounds obvious, but I think I see people get so hung up on wanting really complicated and robust models and all that. And I'll tell you, like, most things I buy personally are like back of napkin numbers, couple columns next to each other, just comparing a couple things. And then I'll also run out the full cash flow. My wife and I own everything ourselves, so we don't have other investors. So once you get to that point, you kind of do need to run out some cash flows and start doing some calculations, because you're going to figure out how to share profits and splits with your equity investors. But it's all about the inputs, really.
Mm-hmm. You make the deal with, you make the money on the deal, like when you buy it. And that's why a lot of people in the short-term rental space are selling their properties now, because they purchased them in 2021 and 2022 when the markets were fever pitched in these markets that everyone's talking about. And they realize the cash flow numbers aren't there. So they realize they basically just bought themselves a job where they're funneling money into these properties. So it's important to be able to, underwrite, even if it's back of the napkin, underwrite this well at the very beginning and think long-term. How have you financed your deals? Like the ones that you've done on the side?
It's all been community, local banks, portfolio loans. So we've intentionally bought everything through LLCs, and gone to some local lenders and gotten portfolio loans. So the terms are not, as good as if you went and got sort of like a 30-year fixed conventional. But just from our perspective and sort of just thinking long term and wanting to own these through entities, we've done that. We've had a couple repeat lenders that we've worked with for, now. I will say we're in the process of buying a 6-unit property right now. And it is a really tough market to find good debt. So we sort of went outside of our repeat lenders, and I think we're going to work with a new lender on this one. So yeah, that's how we've been approaching it to date.
Why have you chosen to go this route, with putting your properties into entities and going with portfolio loans as opposed to just getting some standard conventional 30-year financing that you qualify for personally?
Yeah, it's for us, it's been about from a liability standpoint. So we've tried to upfront really just sort of isolate, ourselves personally from our business and investment holdings. the reality is with these loans, you are personally guaranteeing the loans. So there is recourse back to, my wife and I, if, for whatever reason we stop making debt service payments. But, um, from sort of an insurance perspective and just over the long term, we'd like to continue to build this portfolio. We wanted to set it up separately. Like I said, we invest long term. So, a 25 basis point or 50 basis point difference in interest rate shouldn't kill the deal. Like we're not buying deals that are that thin. So although we could get slightly more aggressive terms, or maybe put a little less down through a conventional loan, we've just taken the route to go portfolio loans.
Mm-hmm. Rory, I think a lot of people that would show up at a real estate meetup would listen to what Kyle just said and be like, I don't understand any of those words. Right. I was able to follow in my naivety here. I've kind of picked up some things along the way, but you say it so well, you say it so articulately. I mean, like think back to that college kid, 15 years ago, like would he have been able to say that? Probably not. I don't know. Maybe you've been doing this for a while, um, but yeah, it's so logical. Like, Rory, we didn't do that. Like we went down the road of, conventional financing, like, for some of our initial properties. What does Kyle know that we didn't know?
I mean, despite me working in real estate law, even at the time, we kind of tiptoed into the investing space. We found a second home, short-term rental, kind of took a really kind of safe bet with that one, and then grew from there. And then eventually we found ourselves in a situation where we were a little bit bigger. We needed to start to insulate liability, and then we needed to start looking at alternative loans because we had a few too many to start qualifying for the traditional conventional loans. But we kind of found our way into it. And I guess there are pros and cons of this both ways. You could either set up your systems perfectly before you start going, which is great because you have everything ready to go. But I wouldn't recommend that too many people worry about having all their systems and all their processes and everything's buttoned up for growth right away, because then you can paralyze yourself with this analysis and this perfectionism. But it sounds like you did start off with really an eye toward growth in a way that we didn't. We just kind of eased ourselves gently into the real estate investing space.
Yeah, and I will say a lot of it has been learned over time and evolves over time. And I might sound confident saying something like that, but 5 years ago, or 6 years ago when I bought my first one, I barely knew what I was doing. I wasn't even sure if I needed to, but it was like it just felt a little bit more safe and conservative long term. I could always do something after. And then over time, I try to develop and figure out if this was the right thing to do long term. I'm kind of at that point now from like a tax perspective, right? Is like there's so many different ways that you can sort of benefit from taxes. And as having a full-time W-2 job, some of that's a little bit more difficult and challenging. So we're kind of just getting to a point now where I'm trying to think a little bit more strategically about that. If I'd done it 6 years ago, maybe I'd be in a slightly different tax position than I am today. But to your point, I wouldn't have been able to grow. I would have been stuck because I would have been trying to figure out tax law, and I'd rather, start growing.
Please tell me that your wife qualifies as a real estate professional.
No, she doesnn't.
Ah.
We're both full time. I know. I talk to my accountant every year. I was like, how do I qualify? And I mean, honestly, we started it, that's a little bit of the tail wagging the dog. And I'm glad we kind of caught ourselves, because everything we've done has been long term to date, but we started looking at some short term rentals, partially because there seems to be the short term loophole that they talk about, and trying to explore that. And to your point earlier about when people were buying up all these short term rentals, like we started getting caught up in that too, right? And we eventually pumped the brakes and said, we were making offers, getting blown out on these like on market deals, being like, they barely penciled when we were, at our initial offer. How does this work? And we eventually just hit pause on it in the markets we were looking at. And I'm so glad we did, because we would have been in the position you just mentioned, which is trying to sell a property in a, resort town that we underwrote 60% occupancy. But the reality is it normalized at 45% after the COVID boom, and I don't want to call it a bust, but just the return to normalcy. So really fortunate, we didn't get caught up in that.
45, in my opinion, is the magic number when you're underwriting short-term rentals. It's got to pencil out at 45. Like ours are 45, 50%. one property, the one that we built last year, was tracking about 65% this year. Like it's just
Wow.
been kissed by an angel with Airbnb. So that one's overperforming. But the one that we purchased in late 2022 is turning out to be more of a really strong tax play for us, because the debt service is so expensive that even having underwritten it like 45%, it's tough to make a dime on it unless
Yeah.
you're squeezing out the other tax benefits. I remember that one is in Guilford, and I had to go before the Zoning Board of Appeals to get my license, as a lot of people are now doing in Guilford. I actually haven't followed up with this, but I know I was like one of the first 10 people to get a license. There's like 300 of them in there, and who knows if the town is actually enforcing this. But initially they were having all the applicants appear before the board, and you're like, all right, this is
Wow.
insane. Right, this is insane to have everyone do this, but like this is
Yeah.
what the process is, so I'll do it. And like my neighbor shows up, because you have to send out a butter letters, and come to find out that she is, she's opposed short-term rentals to the state house in the past, which I didn't realize.
Mm.
She was okay during that meeting. There were definitely a couple questions that were asked, but the question about occupancy came up, and I assured her, I'm like, I can tell you, my place is 45% occupied, whatever it is. Like, half the time nobody's there. She's like, well, it seems like there's more people there. I'm like, I could show you my books. I'm not
Right.
going to, but I could show you my books. I can tell you exactly how many times that place was occupied by people. But 60% was what we saw in 2021 in the short-term rental space. It's probably good that you didn't jump in if you didn't have all those other ways to make money through that loophole, or as a real estate professional. We've certainly talked about both those things on past episodes of the podcast, how Rory and I kind of backed into it, didn't realize that we had the, what do they call it? Like we had the perfect situation where he was the real estate professional, then I was the W-2 earner,
Yeah, sure.
and then it flip-flopped, right?
Then it flipped, but
Then it flipped.
we actually, for last year, we both can claim it legitimately. And then going forward, you're actually now the real estate professional, and I'm doing more and more legal work, which
Yeah.
even ironically, real estate law does not count as being a real estate professional.
I ask every year. I say I spend countless hours doing real estate every day for my W-2. Why is that not make me a real estate professional? And it doesn't. So, if you guys figure it out, let me know.
Talk offline. We have some ideas for you. All right. So what's next, Kyle? What's the plan? I mean, you're going to continue working in your W-2 job because you're doing great with that, and you're
Yeah.
doing this investing on the side. But what's kind of the next plan for you in terms of investing?
Yeah. So, the focus for us continues to be growing a multifamily portfolio in New Hampshire. Like I mentioned, we have looked at plenty of short-term rentals. Part of me wants to diversify into it a little bit. I do think it's probably much more work than it appears. Some of the exciting stuff of thinking about, buying a rental in an enjoyable area and designing it and that kind of stuff, seems appealing, but I know there's a lot more work that goes into it. So I'm not sure if we'll go there yet. One thing we have been doing, just because we bought properties over the last 3, 4, 5 years, the market's been really good to us. So, at the end of last year, we sort of looked at our portfolio and said, is there anything in here that's just not getting a return on equity that we really need? Because the reality is what happens is you buy these properties and, you force some appreciation. The market has helped us, as I mentioned, and you're now looking at it and you're saying, well, the cash flow I'm generating on this relative to the equity that I have in the deal, is very low. So could I do something better with that equity? So we made that decision on a duplex we own at the end of last year. We're on a contract now to sell that. It's supposed to close in the next 30 days, hopefully. And we're under contract to buy a 6-unit property. So we'll do a 1031 exchange, move that equity to this deal, generate a much higher yield, and also buy a much more expensive property. So for example, when this property appreciates 10%, the incremental dollar amount is much less than a property that's half the size, half the dollar amount. So it was a good move for us, hopefully. We may continue to look to do that within our portfolio as the market seems to maybe start to stagnate a little bit in terms of like value growth. I'm not sure exactly, but just making sure we're putting our money to work.
Yeah. Let me dumb that down a little bit, like for the novices and the people like me that, have to hear what you did. So basically, and we were in the same situation. We kind of had a different conclusion though, but you had a property that appreciated because of the state that we're not naming, doing really well, and
Right.
paid down a little bit of the debt, but really the appreciation is probably what did it. You suddenly had more equity in the property. the cash you were getting on rent didn't grow at that same rate. And you're like, whoa, there's a lot of money in this property. Like, we have a higher percentage of equity in this property than maybe we need to have. What if we sold this property, took all that money, put it into a 1031 exchange, so we're deferring our taxes, into a larger property, so we have less equity in that property, but we have enough to leverage for a down payment, right? So let's just say that you had 40% equity in a property that you're now selling, and you're going to 1031 exchange it into a property that maybe you have 20% or 25% equity in, but it's a bigger property. It's worth more
Right.
money. And then you're going to hopefully realize appreciation on that property as well. And you're leveraging your money to be able to do that. Did I get that right? That's as your strategy?
Yeah, generally, I mean, there's different options too, right? Like with this duplex, and we'll use some just round numbers, but we looked at refinancing, right? That's one way to tap into equity. But we have a 4%, I think it was a 3.5 or 4% rate on that. We're not going to refinance and get rid of that rate. We could have opened a line of credit. That can be a little bit difficult with these investment properties, finding someone who will let you take a line of credit out and use that sort of outside of the property. I've found it to be a little difficult. So we said, okay, the other aspect I didn't really include is, we bought this as a duplex. They typically don't generate a bunch of cash flow. They're just, there's 2 units, but there's still one roof. There's still, this one, the utilities weren't separate. There were things about it, but we bought it because it was in an A location, and it was sort of a long-term bet on this neighborhood. And ultimately, we felt that we got the 10 years of appreciation we hoped for in 3. So it's like, okay, time to tap into this. And to your point, we took although our percentage equity is less in the new property, the dollar amount equity is the same. So while we were generating by the end of it, a 2.5% return on our equity in the duplex, the 6 unit, once we kind of go through and push rents on the in-place apartment rents, will be close to a 10%, right? So we're generating more cash off the same amount of equity, was sort of the bet.
Mm-hmm. Well, also, another thing I'm hearing that you don't hear with the short-term rental space, or you do hear it in the short-term rental space, you're not hearing now, is you don't feel too emotionally attached to these properties, or at least because you don't live in them, you don't stay in them, right?
That's right. And we outsource our third-party property management. So we don't have that day-to-day or weekly interaction. So, I mean, certainly it's people's homes, very respectful of that. But yeah, I don't, before I go to bed at night, look at a property and smile at it. And like I might if I owned a place in the mountains or at the lakes or something. So, a little bit less of an emotional attachment.
Rory, we got to get less emotionally attached to all the properties.
Well, I don't think we're emotionally attached to the point where it affects our ability to operate them. I say that as we're getting properties online, we spend time with them and we have make some good memories in each of them. But I don't necessarily feel like I don't feel emotionally attached to the point where it would affect my ability to rent it out to people.
Well, no, of course. But, I think that we need to round out our portfolio with some properties that we're not as emotionally attached to, where we can look at the numbers empirically and, decide to make that decision where it appreciates 10 years worth of equity in 3 years and say, okay, now it's time to cash out, and that's what Kyle's doing with this property. Rory, any final thoughts for Kyle before we get to our last 3 questions?
I think this is a good conversation for people to listen to when they're just getting started, because this shows what you can do by making just some good decisions over the course of not that many years to get yourself in a good situation. And there was I didn't hear anything that was hyped up in this conversation, nothing that was gimmicky, nothing that was magical. It's about going out into the market that making some smart decisions, knowing some basic math and plotting forward.
And trusting your gut sometimes. I'm sure there's a little bit of that involved.
Absolutely.
Okay, Kyle, we ask these questions of all of our guests just to wrap things up and get to know you a little bit better. The final 3 questions. First one is, if you can get on stage for half an hour and talk about any subject in the world with 0 preparation, what would that be?
I'd say if I had to give a professional talk, it would probably be, I'm sure you get it all the time, but it's always just talked about. It's underwriting deals, evaluating opportunities, and in particular, evaluating risk and reward. I think that's something that sometimes gets overlooked. Again, we go back to, you get so into the numbers and the weeds of the numbers. And you have to really think about, sort of what risks are you taking relative to the rewards and make sure that they make sense. So that's one thing I talk about. And then on a personal level, I love being outdoors. I love fishing, and I could talk about that all day and all night. So that'd be my personal
Like fly
presentation.
fishing or ocean fishing, lake?
I love fly fishing. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Second question. Tell us something that happened early in your life or career that impacts the way that you're working today.
I think, I already mentioned it, I guess, but I think that seeing that $323 million wire go through all cash. And what I didn't really mention is that, that property I bought on, with my employer at the time, it was a marketed competitive process. And ultimately, the company I worked for was long-term sort of generational, they were building a generational portfolio. So, they were able to sort of lean in when they wanted to lean in, even if it didn't maybe make sense to an outside investor. And that's how we sort of won the deal. So it just showed me, again, it's sort of like, it's kind of being able to control your own destiny. It's not necessarily about the dollars or the money, but just having that ability to, when you want something that's for the good of yourself and your family, to have the ability to lean in. So that's something I strive to reach.
And the final question we have, tell us something you're listening to or watching or reading these days.
Sure. So I've gone through every real estate book, business books, all of that, over the last several years. The last, I'd say 6 months, I've been trying to get outside of the real estate space, candidly. So there's some podcasts I've been listening to that I like a lot. One's called the All In Podcast. It's sort of a business tech weekly podcast. There's another called My First Million, which is a little bit of a gimmicky title, but I really enjoy the podcast. They get into the nuances and weeds of a lot of different tech businesses and different businesses and startups, and you learn a lot about, I think, building a business. I've also been trying to one thing I think I can, from a personal growth perspective, is sort of sales and marketing. I don't have a lot of experience in that. I can do it from the perspective of pitching real estate deals and stuff like that, but in terms of pitching products or services, I don't have a lot of experience there. So I've been trying to dive into different books and podcasts and there. So I just started one of the Alex Hormozy books. I don't know if it's good or not. He seems like, I don't know. I'm not sure totally about him yet, but trying to improve my skills there.
Yeah, his stuff is good. I mean, I take it with a little bit of a grain of salt just because he's such an influential person.
The louder someone is like that, the I kind of step back for a second and go, okay, like, hold on, is this? But I think there is some good content I've found so far too. So
yeah, I think you're like me. Like sometimes, like the people that are screaming they're not necessarily the people that I relate to the most. So, I listen to what they say, but like I don't lean into that type of person, and some people do, and that's great. And My First Million is great. We interviewed somebody on this podcast, Zach Boos-Cruz, and he interviewed Sam Parr at his place.
Oh, really?
I think in Austin. He did. Zach has this company called Spontaneous, I believe is what it's called. I probably have the name wrong, but Spontaneous. And basically, he has a great podcast called Behind the Stays, and he goes into these really awesome short-term rentals and does these great video tours of them and get the story behind the person that did it. And Sam was going to get into that business, but then he pivoted to whatever that exclusive social network is that he developed. And you're probably a fan of the hustle and trends and all that stuff. I don't know if you subscribe to
Yeah,
those.
I think he's done an awesome job. He seems to be a really interesting guy. And I like podcasts like that because they do a good nice job. It feels like you're sitting in the room listening to them spitball and talk through things. And they're pretty smart guys. They get on some good guests. So I enjoy that one.
Well, I think that's what this podcast became, a bunch of people just spitballing what we're all up to. I mean, we hear from a lot of experts on this podcast, and, a lot of people that want to come on, they have a course to sell or a book that they're promoting or, whatever thing they're selling. And, the interesting thing about how this came together, we just kind of stayed in touch every so often over the years. And, I've asked you if you want to be on the podcast, I don't know, years ago. And you're like, oh, maybe, and the time's not right. But then you came back to me and you're like, I think I want to come on the podcast. So, and this was your first podcast, right?
It was. It was.
All right. Well, I think you did an A+ job, Kyle. So I hope
I
that
appreciate it.
people who are listening still right now probably agree because they're still listening this late into the podcast. But yeah, no, your story, and I'm sure Rory would agree, is so relatable and important for people to hear because it really explains how people can get a foothold into having a diversified income stream for themselves or their household by continuing to work in a W-2 job, valuing the skills that you're getting in the W-2 job, doing a good job for that company, and doing some things on the side to set you up, for the future. And landlording in real estate is as old as the dawn of time, right? So like, there's no surprise that people will want to do this as a way to invest. So, I applaud you for kind of actually taking the steps to do it, because a lot of people that show up at these real estate meetups and they listen to Bigger Pockets and they're in the forums, they just do it for so long and they just never take that step, right?
I
And
know.
yeah, we all could have been victims of that, but we both didn't. So that's great.
Yeah, you eventually you just got to do it, and there, you have to accept that there'll be unknowns and uncertainties, and go for it. So,
Yeah.
I agree.
So if people want to reach out to you, Kyle, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, we'll leave my email address, Kyle at built-properties.com, and please reach out. Happy to chat, real estate underwriting or fly fishing.
Yeah.
So please feel free to reach out.
We'll put that in the show notes. Are we going to see you at any real estate meetups here in the Merrimack Valley or New Hampshire or Boston? Or are you still going to those?
I haven't as much recently, but I do need to get back into it. So maybe we connect offline if you guys have any that you really enjoy. I'd love to hear where you're going.
That we will. Rory, where can people get a hold of you?
If you just go to rorygill.com, you'll see the different ways you can get in touch with me and the different ways I can help you out, from brokering to legal counsel.
All right. And if you want to be a guest on the podcast, realestatelawpodcast.com is where you can find all the episodes, information about us, and our contact form. We schedule interviews throughout the year at various times. So sometimes you catch us at the wrong time, sometimes you catch us at the right time. But reach out to us if we think you'd be a great guest on the show. We will figure out next steps to get you on. So Kyle, thank you so much for being here. Rory, thank you. And thank you for listening or watching. We love your 5-star reviews and your comments. So please subscribe and please let us know how we can improve the podcast. And that's it. We'll see you next time.